He had never asked for medals or parades, never expected a headline or a moment in the sun. For decades, Franklin Hayes carried the memories of men whose names were never written down. But the day he carried General Connors home, he stepped back into a world that had almost forgotten him. Now the young man Daniel wants to know what those medals really mean, not for a headline, not for a speech, just to understand the quiet heroes no one ever saw. And Franklin, he's ready to speak, because some truths are too deep for silence, and some stories deserve to be told. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The last echoes of the funeral ceremony still clung to the cool air at Quantico as Franklin Hayes walked away from the final resting place of General Marcus Connors. He didn't linger for the reception or accept the handshakes offered to him. Instead, he stepped back into the silence of the cemetery's outer paths, his coat buttoned against the soft breeze that carried a scent of cut grass and history. Behind him, Daniel Connors watched from a distance. In the crowd of polished metals and military decorum, the image of the old man's quiet departure felt like a truth too heavy to ignore. Daniel, in his crisp dress uniform, felt a weight on his shoulders that had nothing to do with rank. He wasn't just a grieving son. He was a young officer, still piecing together what it meant to wear the uniform his father had once worn so fiercely, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Franklin held a story his father had never dared to tell. A few days later, Franklin returned to the life he'd known. He stopped by the same small coffee shop he always did, a place with cracked linoleum floors and a neon sign that flickered in the early morning haze. He ordered black coffee, no sugar, and sat at his usual spot near the window. In his apartment, a small shelf held the medals and commendations from his years in service. Most of them were still in the envelopes they'd come in, never framed, never displayed. Franklin wasn't one for ceremonies. He believed that real service didn't need to be announced. At night, when the world grew quiet, he'd sometimes close his eyes and see faces that never aged. Men who'd stood beside him in the mud and the smoke, gone now but never truly absent. He didn't speak of them, but he carried them with him in every line etched into his weathered hands. One late autumn afternoon, as the leaves turned brittle underfoot, there was a knock at Franklin's door. He opened it to find a young man standing there, his face pale but determined. Daniel Connors held out an envelope. Edges worn, the paper soft from years of handling. "My father left this," Daniel said. His voice was steady, but there was something pleading in his eyes. "He told me, if I wanted the truth, I should find you." Franklin took the letter without a word, reading the short, deliberate lines written in the general's familiar scrawl. For a moment, he closed his eyes. The past never stayed buried. Not really, but he'd spent decades learning how to live around it. "I'm sorry," Franklin said softly, "but some truths are best left in the ground." He handed the envelope back, his hand trembling just slightly. Daniel shook his head. "I'm not here to expose anything. I want to understand. My father was a soldier, but I never knew what that really meant to him. I want to know who he was, not for the history books, but for me." Franklin looked at the young man, seeing the echo of the general's determined stare. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he stepped back, motioning for Daniel to come in out of the cold. They sat at the small kitchen table, the steam from 2 cups of coffee curling in the air. Daniel spoke of the nights he'd spent reading every report he could find, every citation, every mention of Ghost Company, but none of it filled the hollow ache in his chest. Franklin listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the dark liquid in his cup. In Daniel's voice, he heard the unspoken ache of a generation trying to find meaning in the shadows of the last. "I'm not asking you to betray your brothers," Daniel said quietly. "I'm just asking, please, help me understand the man who taught me how to stand straight, even when the world tries to push you down." Franklin let out a slow breath, the air thick with memories. "I can't promise you everything," he said, "but I'll tell you what I can." They arranged to meet again the next morning. At a diner just off the bus station, a small, unassuming place where Franklin felt safe. He wanted Daniel to see that the truth wasn't wrapped in medals or memorials. It lived in the quiet spaces, in the small acts of courage no one wrote down. When Franklin arrived the next day, the sun was still low, casting a pale glow across the cracked parking lot. He found Daniel already there, sitting in a corner booth, fingers drumming anxiously on the tabletop, over plates of eggs and toast. Daniel spoke of the weight he carried, the burden of a father's silence that had grown heavier with every year. He spoke of nights spent awake, haunted not by what he knew, but by what he didn't. Franklin listened, his face unreadable. "At last," he said softly, "the hardest part isn't what happened. It's living with the knowing that some debts can't be repaid, only honored." Daniel's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists on the table. "I need to know, Franklin," he whispered. "Not for the headline, for him, for me." For a long moment, Franklin said nothing. Then he reached across the table and rested a weathered hand on the young man's wrist. "All right," he said, his voice rough but sure. "Tomorrow morning, we'll begin. But remember this, the truth isn't always gentle. It's the weight you carry when no one's watching." Daniel nodded, his eyes shining with a mix of fear and determination. In that moment, the boy became a man not in rank or medals, but in the quiet understanding of what it meant to stand for something that wouldn't stand for itself. As they stood to leave, Franklin glanced out the window at the early morning light. In the distance, flags flapped in the breeze, silent witnesses to the history they both carried. For Daniel, this was a chance to learn the story of a father he'd only known through folded flags and silent medals. For Franklin, it was a chance to honor the memory of those who'd walked beside him in the long nights of war. Together, they stepped into the chill of the morning, the promise of hard truths ahead of them. And for the first time in years, Franklin felt the quiet stirrings of something he hadn't allowed himself in a long time: hope. The next morning, Franklin and Daniel met at the diner just after sunrise. The air was cold, the sky streaked with the pale light of dawn, but inside the small restaurant, the smell of coffee and warm bread filled the air. They didn't speak much at first, just shared a quiet understanding that words would come when they were ready. Franklin had mapped out a route the night before, tracing it with his finger on an old road atlas that smelled of dust and time. "We'll start with the village," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not on any map, but it's where the truth begins." They drove through winding back roads, past fields that lay fallow and forests that seemed to hold their breath. Daniel watched the landscape blur past, feeling a strange ache in his chest. He had always imagined his father's world as something grand and heroic, but seeing these empty roads made him realize heroism was often born in places no one ever saw. Franklin spoke as he drove, his words quiet, like he was speaking to ghosts as much as to Daniel. "There was a boy, barely old enough to shave," he said, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "One night, he stood watch through a monsoon, didn't flinch, didn't falter. That was the kind of courage you never see in the papers." Daniel listened closely, his mind painting pictures of mud-soaked boots and flickering lanterns in the rain. He could almost hear the echoes of that night in Franklin's voice, feel the weight of those memories pressing down on the old man's shoulders. And slowly, he began to see that the truth wasn't a single story, it was 100 small acts of quiet bravery. They stopped in a small town that had once been a bustling hub for military convoys. Now, it was little more than a crossroads and a faded general store. Franklin parked the car and stepped out, his movements careful but sure. "This was where we regrouped," he said, nodding toward a crumbling brick building, "where we tried to make sense of chaos." Daniel followed him, feeling the weight of the place settle in his chest. He could see the outline of what had once been a radio tower, long since rusted and silent. In the doorway, an old man sat on a milk crate, smoking a cigarette. He raised a hand in greeting as Franklin passed. Inside the store, Franklin bought a small bottle of water and a roll of mints. "You learn to appreciate the small comforts," he said, handing Daniel a mint with a faint smile. "Out there, it's the little things that keep you grounded." Daniel tucked the mint into his pocket, feeling the smooth shape of it against his fingers. It was such a simple gesture, but somehow it felt like a bridge between the man his father had been and the man sitting beside him now. He realized that the stories Franklin carried weren't just about war. They were about what it meant to be human when the world tried to turn you into something less. They drove on, the road narrowing as they wound through hills that rose up like sentinels on either side. Franklin told more stories about the radio operator who never stopped sending messages, even as shells fell around him, about the medic who carried wounded men on his back through waist-deep mud. Each tale was like a thread, weaving a tapestry of the unspoken history of Ghost Company. Daniel listened, feeling each word settle into the cracks of his understanding. He had always thought of courage as something loud medals, speeches, parades. But Franklin showed him that real courage was quiet. It was a man holding a hand steady in the dark, or sharing a canteen when there was nothing left to give. By the time they reached the outskirts of the old military cemetery, the sun was high and the air smelled of pine and dry earth. Franklin pulled the car over, and they stepped out into the hush of the place. Rows of headstones stretched out before them, white and unadorned, names carved in granite that had weathered decades of rain and sun. Franklin paused at the edge of the field, his eyes tracing each line of marble as if counting old friends. Most of them never got a headline, he said softly. They didn't want one. They just wanted to know someone remembered. Daniel felt a shiver run through him as he followed Franklin deeper into the cemetery. He noticed a small, unmarked stone at the edge of the rows, no name, no dates, just the worn face of history. Franklin knelt there, his hand resting gently on the cold stone. "This is where the Ghost Company lives on," Franklin said. His voice was steady, but Daniel heard the tremor underneath. "No medals, no grand speeches, just the promise we made to each other to never let them fade away." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight. He realized that his father's legacy wasn't in the medals he wore or the titles he earned. It was here, in the quiet reverence of a man who had seen the worst of the world and still believed in something worth fighting for. As they stood there, Daniel finally found the words he'd been searching for. "My father, did he know how much you all meant to him?" he asked, his voice barely above the sigh of the wind. Franklin looked up, his eyes clouded with memories. "He knew," he said simply. "He carried us with him until the end." They walked in silence, the weight of that truth settling over them like a benediction. Daniel didn't need to see the medals or read the reports anymore. He had found what he was looking for, the heartbeat of a legacy that pulsed quietly beneath the noise of the world. But just as they were about to leave, Daniel noticed something strange, a small plaque set into the ground behind the last row of stones. It was newer than the others, the lettering sharp and fresh. He knelt down, reading the words aloud in memory of those whose names were never written, whose stories were never told. He looked back at Franklin, a question in his eyes. Franklin's shoulders stiffened, and for a moment, he seemed to be wrestling with something deep and hard. "That," he said slowly, "wasn't part of any official record. Ghost Company, we once saved a civilian convoy that wasn't supposed to be there. It was a mission no one wanted to admit, too many politics, too much risk." Daniel's breath caught. "My father, he knew about this." Franklin nodded, his gaze distant. He knew, and it haunted him not because it was wrong, but because he couldn't speak of it. Some debts, they don't show up in the history books, but they're still there. Daniel let the words settle in, feeling a weight he hadn't expected. In that moment, he understood that the real story wasn't about medals or glory. It was about the quiet acts of honor that never made the papers, the small kindnesses that kept the world from falling apart. They left the cemetery as the sun began to slip behind the trees, long shadows stretching across the ground. Franklin walked with a quiet steadiness, and Daniel kept close beside him, the unspoken bond of shared truth settling between them. As they drove back down the winding road, Daniel knew they were only at the beginning. The real journey was just starting, and it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, he felt ready to carry it. ChatGPT said the road back from the cemetery was quiet, but the silence felt different this time. Daniel could sense that Franklin was turning something over in his mind, a decision he hadn't yet spoken aloud. The car hummed along the cracked pavement, headlights cutting through the early evening fog. They arrived at the old military cemetery just as the last light of the day slipped behind the hills. The iron gates loomed tall and black, the stone pillars cold beneath the fading sun. Franklin pulled the car to a stop, his hands resting on the wheel for a long moment. Daniel felt a flicker of unease as he looked at the gate. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked softly. His voice was steady, but there was a quaver in it, a thread of fear he couldn't quite hide. Franklin didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under his boots as he walked to the gate. Daniel followed, the air crisp and sharp in his lungs. He could see Franklin's breath in the cold dusk air, each exhale a ghost of resolve. They hadn't reached the gate when a figure emerged from the shadows. A man in a dark suit, posture straight and shoulders squared, stood blocking the path. His face was weathered, the lines around his eyes deep and hard. "Franklin," he said, his voice calm and even. "You don't want to do this." Franklin stopped a few feet away, his eyes narrowing. "I've already done it," he said quietly. "All that's left is to speak the truth." The man's lips twitched into something like a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You're an old man, Franklin, and old men should know better than to stir up ghosts that should stay buried." His tone was gentle, almost sympathetic, but the steel underneath was unmistakable. Daniel looked between them, his heart pounding. "Who is he?" he whispered. Franklin didn't take his eyes off the man, a friend of the truth until it stopped being useful to him. He stepped closer to the gate, the man's shadow falling across his face. The man in the suit didn't flinch. "I'm not your enemy," he said softly. "But if you speak of what happened that night, you'll be putting more than just your own life at risk. There are forces at play here you can't begin to understand." Franklin's jaw tightened. "I understand enough," he said. "Enough to know that silence isn't loyalty, it's betrayal." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He looked at Franklin, at the quiet determination in the old man's eyes, and he realized this was bigger than anything he had imagined. "Franklin, you don't have to do this," he said, his voice trembling. "We can go. We can let it rest." But Franklin only shook his head, his gaze never leaving the man in the suit. "No, Daniel. We owe them this much, the men who never came home, the men whose names no one will ever know." His voice was calm, but there was a finality to it that made Daniel's breath catch. The man in the suit took a step forward, his hand resting lightly on the gate. "This isn't about loyalty, Franklin," he said quietly. "It's about survival. Yours, mine, even his." He nodded toward Daniel. "If you speak, you'll be tearing open wounds that were never meant to heal." Franklin's hand tightened on the cold iron bars of the gate. "Some wounds never do," he said. His voice was low, but every word rang clear in the quiet air. "But that doesn't mean we stop trying to mend them." The man's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice dropping to a warning. "The truth won't bring peace, it will bring ruin. For you, for him, for everyone who ever trusted you." Daniel stepped forward, his hand resting on Franklin's shoulder. "Franklin," he said, his voice cracking, "please, you've done enough. You don't have to fight this battle anymore." Franklin turned his head, his eyes meeting Daniel's. In them, Daniel saw a lifetime of memories of nights spent in foxholes, of promises made in the dark, of men who had never come home. "Son," Franklin said softly, "some battles never end. And some truths, they deserve to be spoken, no matter the cost." The man in the suit let out a long sigh, his breath misting in the cold air. "Then this is your choice," he said. "But understand this, once you step through those gates, there's no turning back. You're not just risking your life, Franklin, you're risking his." He nodded again at Daniel, his eyes cold and flat. Franklin didn't flinch. He looked back at the gate, his hand still resting on the iron. In that moment, he remembered the night so many years ago, the rain pouring down in sheets, the cries of the wounded in the dark, the way the world seemed to hold its breath as they carried the civilians out of the jungle. He remembered the feel of the radio against his back, the weight of a brother's hand on his shoulder, the unspoken vow they had made to each other to protect what mattered, even when no one else would. And in that memory, he found his answer. He looked back at the man in the suit, his voice steady. "I won't let you bury them," he said. "I won't let you turn their sacrifice into a footnote. Not while I still have breath." The man's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "Then you've chosen your path," he said quietly. He stepped aside, his shadow falling away from the gate. "But don't expect mercy from those who stand in your way." Franklin nodded once, the gesture small but resolute. He pushed the gate open, the iron groaning softly in the cold evening air. Daniel followed, his steps hesitant but sure, his hand brushing Franklin's arm as they crossed the threshold. They walked together into the quiet of the cemetery, the last light of day fading around them. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest, but he felt a strange calm settle over him, the calm of a man who knows he's doing the right thing, even if it costs him everything. Behind them, the man in the suit watched in silence. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but his lips moved as he spoke into a small radio clipped to his coat. "They're in," he said quietly. "Begin the contingency." Daniel didn't hear the words, but he felt the weight of them in the air. He looked at Franklin, at the set of his shoulders and the calm in his eyes, and he knew they were walking into something far bigger than either of them could see. But they walked on, side by side, their breath misting in the cold night air. And in that quiet, Daniel understood sometimes. The only thing that matters is to stand up, to remember, to refuse to let the truth be silenced, and to honor those who gave everything so that others might live. The quiet of the cemetery pressed around them like a soft, heavy blanket. Franklin and Daniel walked between the rows of white stones, the last rays of sunlight turning the markers into silhouettes against the deepening sky. Each step felt deliberate, measured like a silent prayer whispered beneath the breath of the world. Daniel pulled a small notebook from his jacket, the worn leather cover warm in his hands. He didn't open it yet, just held it there, feeling the weight of what it meant. It wasn't a tool for headlines or stories to be sold. It was a vessel for memory, a place where the quiet truths of men long gone could finally rest. Franklin stopped at a simple headstone, one whose name had been worn nearly smooth by years of wind and rain. He traced his fingers over the letters, his touch as light as a breath. "He was my radio man," he said softly, almost to himself. Never spoke much, but his voice kept us alive in the dark. Daniel watched the old man's hand tremble, saw the way his shoulders seemed to relax as he spoke. He opened the notebook, the blank page waiting like an unspoken promise. "Tell me," he said gently, "so it won't be forgotten." And Franklin did. He spoke of the nights when the rain fell so hard it drowned out the sound of fear, of the days when hope felt like a distant memory. He spoke of the men who stood beside him, men whose names would never make the history books, but who had carried the weight of the world on their shoulders all the same. As he spoke, Daniel wrote. Each word felt heavy, etched into the paper with the same care Franklin had once given to his brothers in arms. The world around them fell away, the rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of cars on the road, all of it faded until there was only the quiet rhythm of memory, shared and held in that sacred space. When the last of the story was told, Franklin fell silent. He rested his hand on the headstone, his breath slow and even. "They were the best of us," he whispered, "and they deserved more than silence." Daniel closed the notebook carefully, his fingers lingering on the worn leather. "They'll have it now," he said, his voice steady. "Your words, their memory. I'll keep it safe." Franklin turned to him, his eyes soft in the fading light. For a moment, he looked every bit the soldier he had once been, shoulder square, gaze unflinching. But in the quiet of that moment, there was something else too, a deep, unspoken relief. They left the cemetery as the sun dipped below the trees, the air cool and still. Neither spoke as they walked back to the car, the weight of what had been shared settling into the spaces between their footsteps. Daniel held the notebook close to his chest, the final page still damp with ink. In the car, they sat in silence for a long moment. Franklin stared out the window, the reflection of the white stones fading into the night. "You understand now," he said finally, his voice low. "Not everything can be set right, but it can be remembered." Daniel nodded. "And that's enough," he said softly. "That's what matters." The drive back was quiet, the headlights cutting a soft path through the darkness. Daniel thought of the men Franklin had spoken of the lives lived in shadows and the debts that could never be repaid. And he thought of his father, a man who had carried the weight of those memories until his final breath. When they reached Franklin's apartment, the old man paused at the door. "This is where I leave you," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "The rest, that's yours to carry now." Daniel gripped the notebook a little tighter, feeling the pulse of something solid and true beneath his fingertips. "I will," he said simply. "I promise." Franklin stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him. In the quiet that followed, Daniel stood on the small porch, the notebook cradled in his hands. He felt the weight of it, not just the paper and ink, but the lives it contained, the truths it refused to let die. He knew the world would never see these stories the way he had, never feel the weight of the quiet heroism that had shaped his father's life and his own. But he also knew that some truths didn't need to be shouted from rooftops. They only needed to be remembered, carried in the hearts of those who understood. As Daniel turned to leave, he looked up at the night sky. The stars were bright and cold, 1,000 pinpricks of light against the endless dark. He thought of the men whose names were never spoken, whose deeds had never been recognized, and he whispered a silent promise to them that their stories would not be lost, not while he still had breath. Back in his small apartment, Franklin sat in his chair by the window, the soft glow of a single lamp painting the room in warm light. He let out a long, slow breath, feeling the years settle into his bones like the quiet of an old song. The weight of the past was still there, but it felt lighter now. He knew there would be no headlines, no medals pinned to his chest, but that was never what he had wanted. All he had ever asked for was to know that someone, somewhere, would remember not the battles or the victories, but the men who had stood beside him in the dark. And now, with Daniel's promise echoing in his mind, he let the memories rest. Outside, the world moved on cars in the distance, the hum of a city that would never know the quiet truths of men like Franklin. But in that small room, lit by the soft glow of a single lamp, there was peace, because he knew he wasn't alone anymore. The stories were safe, the memories were honored, and for Franklin Hayes, the old soldier who had carried so much for so long, that was enough. In the end, some truths don't need a monument. They live on in the quiet hearts of those who choose to remember. And sometimes, that alone is enough. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.